Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Bellinger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Bellinger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at bellingerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 54. This time we step into the world of international politics and diplomatic secrets in the Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Second Stain, from December 1904. And here's Paul to set the scene.
On an autumn morning in an unspecified year, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson's Baker Street rooms are graced by a visit from the Prime Minister, Lord Bellinger, and the Secretary for European Affairs, the Right Honourable Trelawney Hope. It transpires that a document of great moment, an intemperate letter written by an incautious foreign potentate, has gone missing from Hope's dispatch box. It must be traced and returned if disastrous consequences are to be avoided. Holmes is rapidly on the scent and believes that one of only three conspiratorial agents, Eduardo Lucas, Rothiere or Oberstein, could be involved. The investigative waters, however, are very soon muddied by an unexpected intervention from Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope and the brutal murder of Eduardo Lucas at his Westminster home, a case which falls on Inspector Lestrade, who calls Holmes' attention to a curious discrepancy between a bloodstain and a misplaced rug.
Now, The Adventure of the Second Stain was the somewhat unexpected 13th and final instalment of the return of Sherlock Holmes, a series that was intended to consist of 12 adventures at the most. The return came about as a result of the phenomenal publishing success of The Hound of the Baskervilles, after which Conan Doyle was approached by the publisher of the US periodical Collier's Weekly to write a new series of short stories for them. As before, he was offered an almost eye-watering sum, $25,000 for 6, $30,000 for 8, and $45,000 for 12 stories. And that was just for the US rights. Conan Doyle would be able to get similar sums from the Strand for publication in the UK. Conan Doyle initially committed to write 8 stories for Collier's, which he wrote between April and September 1903. But by early December, he'd agreed to write a further 4 stories, bringing the total to 12. He completed the last of these, The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, on the 26th of April 1904, after which he wrote to the Strand editor, Herbert Greenhouse Smith, to say he now felt he was able to let Holmes rest in peace. So what about this 13th story, The Second Stain? Well, the origin seemed to lie in a lunch between the US editor and publisher Samuel Sidney McClure, SS McClure, and Conan Doyle in November of 1903. Conan Doyle had known McClure's for the best part of a decade since he'd founded McClure's magazine in 1893. And after their dinner, Conan Doyle advised his literary agent, A.P. Watt, that he might sell McClure a one-off story for, quote, a special purpose. Now, what that purpose was unclear, but since Conan Doyle had been an investor in McClure since 1894, whatever was commercially successful for McClure would almost certainly lead to some success for Conan Doyle too. Unfortunately, though, A.P. Watt was a little cagey, and he advised Conan Doyle that the story should only be offered to McClure's after the Collier's run of 12 adventures had been finished. And so in May 1904, Watt wrote to McClure's to gauge their interest in a final Holmes story, with the request that it be published in 1905. But somewhat surprisingly, McClure's declined the offer. It appears that they felt that a one-off story was going to be insufficient to boost their subscriber numbers. And so The Second Stain was then offered to Collier's and the Strand as the last instalment of the return. It was probably written over the summer of 1904, as Watt eventually sold the story in September of that year. And this time Conan Doyle could relax, feeling sure that he'd put paid to Sherlock Holmes once and for all, having retired him off to a life of beekeeping and pleasurable obscurity on the Sussex Downs. The story then first appeared in the Strand magazine in the UK in December 1904 and in Collier's Weekly in the USA in January 1905. And it was included in the first UK edition of The Return, which came out in March of that year. The manuscript itself has survived, and it's quite an interesting one. It was printed by the BSI Press in 2013, and it's slightly peculiar in that 6 pages of the manuscript are not in Conan Doyle's hand. They were identified in the 1970s as being written by Jean Leckie, and there is some precedent for the manuscripts being written in other hands. A few pages of The Dying Detective are written by Conan Doyle's secretary, Alfred Wood, and there is another person's hand at work in A Scandal in Bohemia. But The Second Stain is the example where the most number of pages written by another hand is the case. It has led some people to suggest that Jean Leckie wrote some of the story, although I think Randall Stock has convincingly argued that she was taking dictation. What is interesting, though, I think, is that the story was written in 1904, 2 years before Conan Doyle's first wife died of tuberculosis, and from a hotel, no less. So it gives us some more information about the familiarity between Arthur and Jean before they were able to marry. And Phil Burgum has pointed out that it's somewhat hypocritical in this case that Holmes should lecture a wife to come clean to her husband when he might not have entirely come clean to his own wife, although it has been suggested that Conan Doyle's first wife knew about his relationship with Jean Leckie and indeed endorsed it. But interestingly, this isn't the first time that we've heard of the adventure of the Second Stain, because it was a title that Conan Doyle had trailed a couple of times before.
Yeah, it's one of these. Obviously, before it was published, one of these titles for Holmes fans to play around with, because those who are really familiar with what were then the first 2 collections will have noticed that the title, The Second Stain, is mentioned twice by Watson in 2 different stories in the memoirs. It first appears in The Yellow Face, when Watson says, "Now and again, however, it chanced that even when he erred, the truth was still discovered. I have notes of several half-dozen cases of the kind, of which the affair of the Second Stain and that which I am now about to recount are 2 which present the strangest features of interest." So he'd already mentioned it there, but without any mention of the politics. Just sounds like a standard case. But then later on in the Naval Treaty, and interesting with that being a story of skullduggery and high politics, it's interesting that the Second Stain then gets mentioned in that. And we also have other hints which we'll talk about later, put into this. It's rather a long quote, but I think it needs kind of quoting in full. "The July which immediately succeeded my marriage was made memorable by 3 cases of interest in which I had the privilege of being associated with Sherlock Holmes and of studying his methods. I find them recorded in my notes under the headings of The Adventure of the Second Stain, The Adventure of the Naval Treaty, and The Adventure of the Tired Captain. The first of these, however, deals with interests of such importance and implicates so many of the first families in the kingdom that for many years it will be impossible to make it public. No case, however, in which Holmes was ever engaged has illustrated the value of his analytical methods so clearly, or has impressed those who were associated with him so deeply. I still retain an almost verbatim report of the interview in which he demonstrated the true facts of the case to Monsieur Dubuc of the Paris police and Fritz von Wartbaum, the well-known specialist of Danzig, both of whom had wasted their energies upon what proved to be side issues. The new century will have come, however, before the story can be safely told." So you get some interesting hints there. As to what will be coming up eventually, and you know, it's not to speculate if Doyle is often given this kind of slapdash persona with regard to the Holmes stories, but it is interesting that with the Second Stain here, this list he gives in the Naval Treaty, you've got a story which is obviously of political import. And then we end with the new century will have come, however, before the story can be safely told. And that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, it is.
So it's nice to think, that he might have gone back to this, and he's having a bit of fun, and also, tipping the hat to those Sherlock Holmes fans who've noticed this and been waiting for this story to
Yeah.
appear.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, as well? Because one of the other potential influences for why the second stain was eventually a story told was that in June 1903, the US magazine The Bookman ran an article appealing for Conan Doyle to fill in some of the blanks in
Mm.
those missing cases. And in fact, the Bookman's editor, or junior editor, Arthur Bartlett Morris, had met Conan Doyle, and he was particularly keen on the second stain being the adventure to be filled in, as it were. Although I think timing wise, he probably already had the idea of the second stain in his head. I mean, you get the sense that Conan Doyle probably, you can imagine him sat there at the breakfast table, turning over the tablecloth and spotting that there was a stain under there, and coming up with this idea, and it's sort of sitting there in the back of his mind for several months or years even before he comes up to it. But there's definitely a sense in that second description that we're getting closer to the story that will eventually be told.
And then when we actually get the story, there's this lovely opening with Watson explaining how it can be told, and you get this image of Watson pestering Holmes, going, please, 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 please let me tell this story.
Yes.
Constantly, and he says, it was only upon my representing to him that I had given a promise that the adventure of the second stain should be published when the time was ripe, and pointed out to him that it was only appropriate that this long series of episodes, i.e. the return, should culminate in the most important international case which he has ever been called upon to handle, that I at last succeeded in obtaining his consent that a carefully guarded account of the incident should at last be laid before the public.
Yeah.
So that ties in beautifully with the naval treaty version,
absolutely.
that we're giving the hint of. So it's very playful.
It is very playful, in a similar spirit of playfulness. I like the idea that you can sort of knit these together. When we think about what happens in the second stain, we're almost hearing the first half of a story, in the sense that we see the effect of espionage, but behind that there is a network of European spies and a European side of the story to be told. So it's quite possible that all this stuff about Dubuc at the French police could be, a second. What Holmes does after the second stain, he might be entrusted by the Prime Minister to go to Europe and carry on with the investigation, and maybe that side of it isn't quite as successful as the bit that we read here.
Yeah, it all it does tie together nicely, and then you've also got the get out clause on the part of Conan Doyle and Watson, where if in telling the story I seem to be somewhat vague in certain details, the public will readily understand that there is an excellent reason for my reticence.
Yes.
So you've got that. Well, if it doesn't match up, this.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is why the names have been changed to protect the innocent, and so
indeed. But it is a rare case, isn't it? In that this is one of those missing adventures that is filled in. Conan Doyle was such a great one for sort of teasing the audience with these brilliant titles like The Politician, The Lighthouse, and The Train Cormorant, or The Giant Rat of Sumatra. The second stain is possibly one of the less exciting titles.
Yes, that's probably why he could do it, because with the others, he already, just by the titles, he paints himself into a corner.
Indeed, yeah, he's got nowhere to go really with those. But with this one, he can maybe go somewhere. But yeah, it's great, and I've always liked the missing episode side of things, because it kind of gives you this enormous hinterland to their story.
And again opens out the world of Holmes, that he's not just any old private detective. This is somebody who, is in the league of spying himself to a certain extent, and has close contacts. The fact the Prime Minister and the Minister for European Affairs can just roll up on his doorstep.
Yes,
this doesn't just happen to any private eye.
Yes, and he does become a spy for the state later, of course, in his last bout.
And of course, his brother is the British government, although we don't find that out here.
No, that's true. No, there's no sign of Mycroft here, is there?
He might have just been written out by Watson.
And the stakes in this story are really very high indeed. I mean, we're talking about European war. And so, it's interesting to think about this story from the perspective of both when it was written and also when it's set, because they're obviously not the same thing. The Prime Minister, Lord Bellinger, in this says that the whole of Europe is an armed camp. There is a double league which makes a fair balance of military power. Great Britain holds the scales. If Britain were driven into war with one confederacy, it would assure the supremacy of the other confederacy, whether they joined in the war or not. So, that's in the story, but there is an echo there in terms of what is happening in 1904 as this story is being written by Conan Doyle. You have the signing in April of 1904 of the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France, which was not really a formal military alliance, but a series of agreements and sort of to resolve what had been sort of long-standing colonial disputes. And significantly, it aligned Britain and France against the sort of growing influence of Germany and the Triple Alliance, which is almost certainly the sort of confederacy that is referred to here. The Triple Alliance being a military pact between Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy, which was created in the 1880s but still active by 1904. And then outside of that, you've got the sort of wider context of what's happening with Russia and Eastern Europe. So also sort of 1904-5, a bit later, you've got the Russo-Japanese War, but this sign that Russia is being weakened in the eyes of the world militarily and politically, and then also a series of Balkan crises as the Ottoman Empire starts to collapse in the years leading up to the First World War. So you have, when Conan Doyle was writing the story, a really fraught international situation with essentially the Triple Alliance in Central Europe, Russia on the back foot to the east, and then Britain and France finally sort of coming together as a Western alliance. And this really sets the scene for what will eventually play out as the First World War. So you can feel Conan Doyle is echoing that in the setup of this story. But that's when the story is written. When the story is set is something very different, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one that you can. It's obviously been one of these things that Sherlockian chronologists have argued about a lot, inevitably. But really, you look at the internal evidences, and it's a story that really you can place
Mm.
within a specific window. So we know that the second stain is there mentioned in the naval treaty.
Yeah,
Therefore, it is pre-Great Hiatus.
yeah, yeah.
So it's an earlier one, and then you look at the evidence of who's in the story, and I think it's pretty difficult to dispute that the potentate in question is Kaiser Wilhelm II,
Mm-hmm.
the Prussian King German Emperor,
Mm.
because it just fits his nature. The whole
Mm.
thing fits with his character. And we have this mentioned twice in the story. It's a potentate and a sovereign.
Yes.
It's obviously nothing to do with France because France is a republic. It's not Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Totally out of character for him. It isn't Tsar Alexander III either.
No.
So this has got to be Wilhelm II, who came to the throne in 1888. If we're saying from the internal evidence of this, it's pre-Great Hiatus, it is therefore sometime between 1888 and 1891.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I disagree with two of the great chronologists on this. William Baring Gould, who plumped for 1886, and D. Martin Dakin, who went for 1894. So with that in mind,
Mm.
you, as you've just pointed out, Mark, you've got a different political situation to deal with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is before the Entente Cordiale, and this is a period when the threat to Britain is not seen primarily as German.
No.
The threat at this time, it's France
Mm.
we're still looking at, and Russia to an extent, because at this
Yeah.
time we've still got the so-called Great Game,
Yeah. Yeah.
with Britain and Russia tussling for power in Central Asia and around the northwest frontier of India and Afghanistan and so on. It's really hinted at in the story that it's agents of those two powers are the
Yes.
ones who would hope to benefit by creating some sort of rift between Germany and Britain at this time. So it's a different setup to the political situation at the time that Doyle wrote this story.
Yeah.
I think it's important to emphasise that. So if you begin to kind of get your head around the fact that we're talking almost 2 timescales here, if you're talking Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the thing that's upset him in the letter apparently is some recent colonial developments on Britain's part.
Yes.
And you look at what was going on about at this time, late 1880s, early 1890s. And I would think one of the most likely candidates for this is the gold fields and the mining in South Africa.
Yeah.
And the granting of concessions. And the fact that the British are overriding the Boers on so many of these things, and Germany has a double hand. They favour the Boers, and also they want concessions themselves, of course. So at this time, we've got between 1888 1899 mining concessions being awarded to Cecil Rhodes and to the newly formed, very pro-British Werner Beit mining company, and this is the kind of thing that would conceivably rattle.
Yeah.
The Kaiser when he's in one of his more belligerent moods.
Yeah.
And we've got a kind of historical backup for this, because in 1895, after the failure of the Jameson raid, the British raid into the Transvaal, which was all supported by Rhodes, and was an abject failure and a farce, the Kaiser actually wrote a congratulatory telegram to Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal, congratulating her on the failure of the Jameson raid. So there is definite historical precedent for what is happening in this story.
Yeah, I like the idea that it's something to do with the South Africa and the Boer War. I mean, the other character around this time I think would be interesting and could potentially play into that is actually William III of the Netherlands, who is a really astonishing character in that he was a very large, boisterous, and rumored to be insane. He was prone to fits of violent outburst, and would make ridiculous statements, which then had to be sort of suppressed quite quickly. And actually, in this period, just the very last years of his reign, I think he died in 1890. The last 2 or 3 years, his wife becomes regent, because actually he was so mentally incapacitated. But he's one of those people who sort of has violent outbursts. So I kind of like the idea that this potentate might actually be him as well. That's quite a nice one. But I think it's much more likely, as you say, that it's going to be Wilhelm II. I mean, apart from anything else, the context here is the scramble for Africa, isn't it? I mean, you've got immense tensions between all the European powers, but particularly Britain and Germany.
And also the fact that we know from this that the Bellinger and Trelawney Hope are arguing that if this gets out, this is European war.
Yeah. That's right.
The Netherlands is not important enough at this time to actually cause that. But yes, I do like the idea of this wonderful, belligerent, unthinking man.
Yes. I think the thing against him is the fact that he had these violent outbursts so often that people would just be able to dismiss the letter as another one. I mean, the other bit of tension around this time is the episode around Zanzibar, which is around 1890. So there was a Berlin conference in 1884-5, which had formalized the sort of way in which the European powers were basically taking possession of Africa, and it led to a whole series of colonial disputes. But in 1890, there was a brief peace, as it were, between Germany and Britain, when Germany recognized British control over Zanzibar on the East African coast, and Britain agreed to acknowledge German interests around Lake Tanganyika and in German East Africa. And in return, Britain ceded an island of Heligoland in the North Sea, which would eventually become important for the German Navy. And you can imagine that, this moment when there is a very delicate trade negotiation is going on, that, a fiery outburst of horror from Wilhelm II at that point could be another kind of fracture point. It's a bit like that moment in A Foreign Office Romance, which we covered in a previous episode, that there's a very delicate balance, and if some piece of news lands at the wrong moment in time, it's going to have tremendous consequences. So I kind of like that. That's another option in addition to South Africa that puts more weight that our certain foreign potentate is going to be Wilhelm II. So certainly in character and personality, this feels very much like Wilhelm II. But what about the Prime Minister then and the Foreign Secretary?
Yeah, now this is again where you enter rather ticklish territory as to who they might be, because again, it's this whole question of dating.
Yeah.
There's obviously disguises going on here from the names themselves. But we do have the description of Lord Bellinger, the Prime Minister, as being austere, high-nosed, eagle-eyed and dominant, with a gaunt aesthetic face. And Watson, so the whole admiring tone
Yes.
that Watson gives to this, it does suggest that this is based on William Ewart Gladstone.
Yes, absolutely.
The great Liberal Prime Minister, who served several terms. Although Watson might not be so admiring, because he was also the man who was responsible for Gordon's death in many eyes.
Indeed.
So Watson might not have admired him for that. But bygones be bygones, obviously, and Watson is very admiring of this individual. So it definitely, from the description, and Sidney Paget plays along with this.
Yeah.
With the way he actually draws the character. The second one is more difficult. Trelawney Hope. He's described as dark, clean-cut and elegant, hardly yet of middle-aged, and endowed with every beauty of body and mind. We also know he has a moustache because he pulls nervously at it in the interview. There are two possible candidates who fit it physically. One is Lord Lansdowne, who was Foreign Secretary at the time the story was written. But you have another candidate, don't you?
Oh, yeah. He just reminded me, that description reminded me a bit of Joseph Chamberlain. And Chamberlain being a rising star. And, looks-wise, I think is a possible contender for it as well. Although I don't really think Joseph Chamberlain would quite go into the fit of almost hysterics that Trelawney Hope goes into.
No.
But definitely, I think he feels like, it's one of those things where you can feel Conan Doyle picking up the influences of various people.
Definitely.
I mean, Salisbury is the Prime Minister who, in a weird way, kind of almost fits the bill too. Although the description is very much Gladstone, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Salisbury is the one who fits, certainly what I've gone with in timing, the 1888 to 91, because Salisbury was Prime Minister at that time. But the problem is he was also Foreign Secretary.
Yes. Well, unless that's Watson's disguise.
Yes, absolutely. And Salisbury doesn't fit either of those descriptions. He was quite rotund, very thick, full beard, very expressive and sagacious in his own way, but not like Gladstone. But I quite like the idea here that Doyle is playing a game that this could be that Salisbury, but it would be far easier for Salisbury to visit on his own as both Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister to discuss this matter. I mean, it would make it a damn sight simpler.
It would. Although I think it's a nice idea that he basically goes, okay, well, I'm going to really disguise Salisbury by actually splitting this into the responsibility of somebody else, just to not really embarrass the Prime Minister so much. But that would then, of course, put suspicion on Salisbury's wife. As a candidate in, which is not possibly the right thing to do. The other thing that occurred to me, just as an aside on this, is that another possible kind of Foreign Secretary around the period, if you're thinking about Salisbury, is Sir Stafford Northcote, who was Lord Eidsley, and when Salisbury became Foreign Secretary as well, he basically did so because he'd just fired Northcote. And a few days after he'd been fired, and Northcote was walking up the stairs at number 10, felt desperately ill, was taken to the antechamber of the Prime Minister's office and died in front of cabinet ministers. So the poor chap finished his days in Number 10 in a bit of ignominy. Really,
Mhm.
he's an interesting character. One of his sons was Amyas Stafford Northcote, who wrote some ghost stories in the manner of M.R. James, and wrote
Very
quite
fine they are too.
quite a good one called Mr. Mortimer's Diary.
Mm.
Is very, very M.R. James as well. But that's somebody else. But I'm not sure it's quite Salisbury in this one. The other person who's really interesting to identify here is one of the spies, is Eduardo Lucas, because here there's some pretty good evidence that actually Conan Doyle is basing this on a real person.
I think with this whole story, he's having a lot of fun. And to go back to the characters we've just been discussing, he knows that his readers will be, who's this?
Yeah.
He knows they will be playing this game themselves. That he's playing a game with his public. And yeah, as you say, he's doing the same with Eduardo Lucas, because Eduardo Lucas, it was originally written Edward Lucas.
In the
I think I'm
manuscript.
right in saying, yeah. Now, there was a real Edward Lucas who Conan Doyle knew. Is the writer E.V. Lucas, Edward Verrill Lucas. And Doyle knew him well at this time, with the time he was writing the story, through both the literary world and the cricketing world.
Yes.
Because Lucas was a very popular humorist and essayist, very light touch, very prolific.
Yes.
Very popular. He's one of these writers who has suffered this, enormously popular in his own time and almost forgotten now.
Yeah, completely.
Perhaps the thing he's left as most is the fact that he introduced A.A. Milne to E.H. Shepard and gave us the classic look for the world of Winnie the Pooh. He's a fascinating character. He worked his way up. He started as a journalist. One of the papers he worked on was The Globe, which we'll come back to later as well. But he ended up working on Punch and was a director, I think, later in life of Methuen.
Yes, that's right.
Publishing company. But at this time, he's playing for two cricket teams. The Punch cricket team, and he also becomes a member of the Ala Akbaris, J.M. Barry's cricket team, which Conan Doyle was also famously a member of. So they're knocking about in this same world, and there can be no doubt that Eduardo Lucas is a tip,
yes,
towards E.V. Lucas. Now, I don't know if it's entirely complimentary, because Lucas he wrote these light essays, and years later, his daughter Audrey said of him that her father once described himself as a bedroom author, meaning this: that any of his works might with safety be put by the bedside of a very young girl or a very old lady. So they're these kind of safe, pleasant essays, observations on life and humorous observation. But Audrey also notes that he had a bit of a double personality, or these essays don't represent his true character in many ways. And she said, in private, he was a cynical clubman, liking to entertain peers to sumptuous meals with champagne and brandy, very bitter about men and politics and the decadence of modern art. So you've got this side to him, which Doyle will have seen, once they're off the cricket pitch and so on, and it's just the chaps in their club atmosphere, that this side of Lucas would come out. He was an alcoholic,
right,
as well, and I think it was Audrey again said that he enjoyed the champagne parties. He enjoyed watching other people enjoying drink, but he drank because he had to. So you've got that darker side to this kind of humorous, light public persona. And I think this comes across in Eduardo Lucas, because we know that Eduardo Lucas, he's a talented amateur tenor.
Yes.
And very popular with parties and so on. He's got this personality that people enjoy and love, and they have no suspicion that he's a spy.
Mm.
and tangled up in that world. Never mind the suspicion that he's also got another or got a
Yeah,
wife in Paris
yeah,
that
double
nobody
life.
knows about. So this is all going on. I think Doyle is kind of pointing to E.V. Lucas with this, and God knows what Lucas himself thought
That's the
when he
amazing
read
thing.
it, because
Yeah.
it was so obvious that it's pointing in that direction. I mean, and another thing with E.V. Lucas, he was rumoured to have a fine collection of pornography. So again, this side of the character, and there's a funny comment Watson makes
Mm.
when he and Holmes go to Lucas's home.
Yeah.
He actually says, every detail of the apartment, the pictures, the rugs, and the hangings, all pointed to a taste which was luxurious and the verge of effeminacy,
Yes. Yeah.
which seems quite coded to
Yeah, very much
me.
so.
It's this kind of what's going on here is he's adding another level possibly.
Yeah. Yep.
And you also get that, I think, in a different way with Audrey Lucas's, saying about E.V. Lucas, describing himself as a bedroom author.
Yes.
There's an ambiguous
It
phrase.
is, isn't it?
She then goes on to explain but she knows, she's a writer herself, so she knows there's an ambiguity in that phrase
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
people, those in the know will probably have a slight chuckle to themselves. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think this is all going on
Yeah.
with Eduardo Lucas, and yeah, as I say, it would be very interesting to know what E.V. Lucas, if he
Made of
had
it.
words with Doyle in the pavilion about this.
Yeah. It is it's astonishing to think that, he could use somebody he was in, fairly regular contact with
Mm,
at that time as a
yeah.
character. I mean, it's even more astonishing when you think that the manuscript does clearly say Edward Lucas crossed out, and then it says Eduardo.
Mm,
And I'd always previously put that down to the fact that maybe Conan Doyle didn't want to give the impression that one of the spies could be a good old Brit,
mm,
a traitor, and change it to Eduardo to give it that kind, another naughty foreigner on British soil. But
mm.
it could be more more directly a kind of just a covering up of a real identity.
And it's strange. It's one of those where the name Lucas, you just think of an Englishman straight away. But perhaps if Doyle had left the O off and just put Edouard, yeah, you could Edouard Lucas. I mean, we
Yeah,
have Maigret. One of Maigret's sidekicks is called Lucas.
Luca. Yeah,
So it's
yeah,
possible there. But and then we get the French background as we find out later. But it just all seems a bit
on the
almost,
nose.
yeah, absolutely. And he might argue, well, the public know him as EV, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, he could be easily identified from this. Yeah.
Mm, mm,
So that's Eduardo Lucas. But there are also two other spies who are mentioned here, as well as La Rothiere, and there is Hugo Oberstein. And Oberstein, we will see again the Bruce Partington plans, in which he plays a much more significant role. But it's interesting that Conan Doyle is laying out this picture of a Britain occupied by
mm,
foreign agents, and in recent years, Conan Doyle has been sort of increasingly recognized for an early contribution to spy fiction. Particularly, it was Andrew Glazard who has written an interesting piece about how the what we would call maybe the diplomatic stories, the naval treaty, the Bruce Partington plans, and the Second Stain all see Conan Doyle establishing many of the tropes of espionage fiction. And this would be very timely because, of course, this is around the same time as Erskine Childers' The Riddle of the Sands, recognized as one of the great early spy stories. But also, there's another person who Conan Doyle was familiar with, and he was very familiar with the works of Conan Doyle, and that's William Le Queux.
yeah, William Le Queux is. I mean, we've discussed him before in various episodes. 'Cause
Yeah.
he's one of these characters who he's difficult to avoid, and again, sort of like E.V. Lucas, a hugely popular writer, and extremely prolific. Who is little known today
Yes.
still. He's beginning to come out of the shadows a bit,
Hmm.
but still not somebody who recognised fully yet, and
Yeah.
there's always the problem as well with the pronunciation of his name.
Yeah.
I've just recently read what is the earliest biography of Le Queux by Ensign Barb Sladen, who was the nephew of Douglas Sladen, another one of Conan Doyle's friends.
Mm.
And there's humorous stuff in there about Le Queux's name. So did it pronounce it William Le Cook?
Oh, yeah. Well,
So that hasn't helped him, but he's one of these characters who built himself up, and you just don't know. He claimed that he was a spy himself,
yes.
and
Yeah.
you don't know how much truth there is in what he says. But certainly an important contributor to early spy fiction.
Mm. Yes.
He was someone who caught on to trends. As you've mentioned, Mark, at this time we've got the second stain is following on the heels really of the Riddle of the Sands. Very
Mm.
different, but two early significant spy stories.
Mm.
And Le Queux is picking up on a lot of this, and he's very much into the school of invasion fiction
Yes.
as well, and the fear. I mean, in 1906, he produces The Invasion of 1910,
Yeah.
which is a scare story about a German invasion. But he's writing all the time about spies, and a lot of this was for the press as well as for his novels.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
and you're painting this picture of Britain being overrun by networks of foreign and particularly German spies,
Mm.
and going off on crazy expeditions to East Anglia, financed by Lord Northcliffe, looking for German spies, and,
Yes.
presumably they were all carrying their copies of the Riddle of the Sands as well.
Yeah.
Their pictures is of Britain riddled by spies. What's interesting with Second Stain is straight away Holmes says, "Well, I know the three men, the three
Yes.
most likely men." Straight onto the three. Not that there's a massive network.
Yes.
And Doyle is actually closer to reality. I think at the time of the outbreak of the First World War, they found about 21 German spies in
Yeah.
the country,
Yeah.
or identified. So it's not this network.
No.
But Le Queux certainly wants to give that impression. It helps sell his books. It helps sell him,
Yeah. I mean,
and also his views. And as I say, was financed and pushed by Lord Northcliffe,
yeah.
and Lord Roberts as well for their own reasons.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think Le Queux himself was very influenced by Conan Doyle, as you can see, because I mean, a few of his works are straight rip-offs.
Yeah,
Uh,
he did a lot of that sort
yeah, I
of
mean,
thing.
there's Who's Findeth a Wife, 1897, about the recovery of an Anglo-German treaty that could push Europe to war, which sounds remarkably familiar. And then there's a collection of short stories called Spies of the Kaiser, 1909, which has a story called How the Plans of Rosyth Were Stolen, which Glazard has rightly pointed out is a straightforward rip-off of the Bruce Partington plan. So, but other people have been inspired by him down the years. I mean, he wrote another collection of short stories called Secrets of the Foreign Office. 1903 came out the year before the Second Stain, which has the character of a diplomatic freelancer, as he's described, called Duckworth Drew, who many people have said is an inspiration for James Bond. Although he's not, it's not that obvious a direct line, it has to be said. He's a terrible one for having alliterative names because his detective is called Ray Raymond, which is about as uninspiring as you can get, really. But it's interesting, isn't it? Looking back at the Second Stain, that you can really see how it is starting to lay down some of the mechanics of the spy novel. And then the other thing I think that's interesting about it is that Conan Doyle doubles down on it by coming back to it with the Bruce Partington plans, and it's more of that kind of world building that we talked about at the beginning. The world building through a mission of the kind of missing stories that are never going to be told, and then later. Here we suddenly have Conan Doyle setting up his own internal continuity and actually coming good on it later.
It does seem he's paying more attention than people often give him credit for.
Yeah.
And with this, and as you say, world building. And this is the difference when you talk about someone like Le Queux. Le Queux and Doyle, they're different worlds in terms of the actual literature. Le Queux is just churning out pot boilers.
Yeah. Yep.
For mainly financial reasons, but other reasons as well to push certain views. And as I say, with Northcliffe was quite happy to be behind the scenes with Le Queux. And the other thing with Le Queux, I mentioned earlier about E.V. Lucas working on the Globe. And this is a paper as well that Le Queux worked on. So, we might have had a crossover with them. And again, it's this worlds meeting each other.
Yeah, very good.
And for all that Le Queux's own work isn't, in literary terms, fantastic, he's hugely popular. So he creates a model that the other writers, the better writers, can pick up on. And obviously Doyle's playing his part in this. And then later on, 1915, we've got the 39 Steps.
Yes, does it
which
again.
takes the same thing, but it does it in a far more stylish way.
Yeah.
And with that, you've got the Black Stone.
Yes.
The group of German agents.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's done in a far cleverer way.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, it's not that there's a massive group of them, but the ones who are here are they're highly efficient.
Yes.
And Buchan really just takes this and perfects it.
It's also worth saying, I mean, in the same way as, you're talking about Le Queux providing the basis for inspiration and then Conan Doyle and others riffing off it. I mean, the other literary influence on this story clearly is the Purloined Letter by Poe. And there's another example of, a writer who came before where Conan Doyle is perfecting the format that's been broken by somebody else. And Purloined Letter is an important one because Conan Doyle doesn't just steal it for the Second Stain, he steals it for A Scandal in Bohemia, and he has it for the Naval Treaty as well. And each time he's playing with it slightly differently, but it's all coming from the same starting point, really.
It's taking it that little bit further, where in the Purloined Letter you've got the letter literally hiding in plain view, whereas with this the letter is floating about.
Yes,
but it isn't. And there's almost a level of this. Of a kind of comedy of errors.
Yes, that's right.
Going on with this and the coincidence of Lucas's murder.
Yes.
And the lovely way that Doyle plays with this is the man's death can't be a coincidence. It can't be, and it is.
Yes.
It's beautifully played. And to me, I wonder as well if Doyle had read another novel published earlier than the Emperor's Candlesticks. Which is Baroness Hawkes's first novel.
Yeah.
And this involves a pair of antique candlesticks which have a cavity you can hide messages in. And they're being used to transport a message, I think, from a cardinal. And then they get mixed up and get in the baggage of an anarchist who's also putting messages, and he finds there's somewhere to hide my message. So you got one candlestick has an official message in that's being smuggled past customs, and then another candlestick has the anarchist's message in, and it is this whole comedy of errors.
Yes.
And it's also that's interesting in itself, because the official spy, the one who's working part of the official agencies, is a woman.
Right.
So we've got one of the first female spies.
Yeah.
Is in that story. And I like to think, has Doyle read this and again likes this idea of the comedy of errors as the documents get mixed up or they get into places they shouldn't be and they're found by accident. All that sort of element is coming in with the Second Stain.
Well, that kind of comedy of errors and gender swapping puts me in mind of another possible influence, which is actually Oscar Wilde's An Ideal Husband, which is the play came out 1895, and Richard Lancelyn Green in the Oxford edition of the Return noted that the last scene of the Second Stain bears a lot of similarity to the final act of that play. But if you look, into that play a little more deeply, I mean, it's fundamentally about the life of a senior politician, Sir Robert Chiltern, who is a very respected politician, but essentially is coming a cropper because his past is catching up with him when a scheming woman sort of possesses a letter that he's written in his youth, and he's being held to it, and it's really about him. Well, part of it's about him and his wife, Lady Chiltern, and obviously who is holding her husband up as an ideal standard, hence the title. But in a strange way, it's Conan Doyle's story is a bit of a reverse of that. So yes, that might be another possible influence on
Mm,
this story. Something else that's just in the ether as he's writing this
mm,
this great adventure.
mm,
You mentioned then as well about the coincidence at the heart of it. I mean, it's one
mm,
of the things that people have criticized the story for is that Holmes says it must be a coincidence, and then later he dismisses it as a
mhm.
trivial incident. I mean,
Not
it's
for
part
Lucas.
not for Lucas. Well, that's true. But part of I think it's part of Holmes's vulnerability. I mean, I certainly read his comment about it being, oh, it's just a trivial incident, is him covering up his obvious mistake. But
Mm,
but I think it also, takes us to the heart of something about the Sherlock Holmes stories, which is that we often think about them as detective and crime stories, and there's not a great deal of detection in the Second Stain, but really, they're more than detective or crime stories.
mm,
They're adventure stories. That's in the very title of most of these cases. We sort of, if we think about them purely in terms of detection and resolution, you kind of miss some of the enjoyment and the fun of these, and particularly I think in the diplomatic stories, where yes, there is some quite heavy plotting, but actually you're getting what are really sort of early thrillers. Um,
definitely. Mm.
yeah,
And you've got in this story in particular, where you've got agencies working against each other.
yeah,
And unknowingly, in the case of Lestrade and
yes,
the official police, they don't know
yes,
that they're working against a certain another arm of government, or it's not a conflict as such, but
mm,
they're not able to work in tandem. And that it's fascinating the way that's explored in the fact that Lestrade doesn't know that
yeah,
he's giving the final clue
yes.
to a totally different
It's
case.
wonderful, yeah,
Mm,
and that the great threat that every man's hand is against us.
mm,
That's such a wonderful setup. I mean, so I think we can read this primarily as a kind of adventure thriller. That said, I think people have been somewhat overcritical of the sort of lack of detection here. I mean, reading it again, I was really struck by the fact that at the end of that first encounter with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, Sherlock Holmes already has Lady Hilda in his sights.
mm,
His very first question is, who knew about the letter? Surely your wife knew. And then he doubles down. Could she have guessed?
mm,
And that's a bit of wonderful misdirection on Conan Doyle's part in that he's putting out
mm,
there, it can't possibly be her. It's so
mm,
obvious. He's putting her right in the foreground. But actually, the next scene we get is Lady Hilda turns up at Baker Street.
mm,
And, if you follow through the chronology of what happens in the adventure itself, Holmes must have had the idea at the end of that meeting that yes, it's absolutely her.
mm,
To the point where he then starts carrying around a photograph,
mm,
um, on the off chance that he can produce it in this case to PC Macpherson.
mm.
There's clearly a bit more deduction going on there.
But the one thing, if that is the case, and I think you're right on that, but you would think he'd simply tail
Yeah,
Lady Hilda
yeah, that's right.
all the time until she, because he knows she knows something, and if he tails her, then yeah,
Well, it's
it's again developing the new genre
it is,
in a
yeah,
way, and kind of how do the conventions of the detective or the crime story
yes,
then pad out into the newly developing conventions of spy and espionage fiction, and in a way, a clumsy way. This is kind of what Le Queux is doing as well,
mm, that's
but
right. He is,
it's in a less sophisticated way.
yeah. I mean, it's
Mm,
quite possible Holmes was out tailing Lady Hilda,
mm,
because we don't actually see his detection at all. We have
mm,
Watson saying, "Oh, Holmes is out and about and coming back at
yes,
odd
yeah.
times." I mean, you get the wonderful line about the sure sign that Holmes is behaving oddly is that he's eating sandwiches at unusual hours, which is such a great observation. That's how you know that Sherlock Holmes
And that
is up to something.
brings up this kind of again, the image of Holmes is lurking about Lady Hilda's. Maybe you've got Madame Fournay is lurking about.
Yes, that's right.
There's again this comedy of errors
Yeah, yeah,
going
yeah.
on. This black comedy.
Yes, there is.
behind the scenes with this, and that brings us back to, yes, well, where you talk about the possible influence of Wilde, and that's very
Of
much.
course, that's right.
Mm,
Very much in his wheelhouse.
mm,
I mean, the other thing there is this sort of doubling of things. I mean, this has been pointed out by
mm,
Christopher Metras in an article in English Literature in Transition. He talks about how there are lots of doubles: as two stains, two letters, two
mm,
scandals, two
mm,
husbands, two wives. Two photographs. There's lots of doubling in there as well. And I think he points out that while diplomacy is about concealing things, detection is about revealing things.
mm, mm.
Even in this story, we don't get the reveal. You never find out what is in this letter. You
No.
never find out who wrote it, even though, and you've got the wonderful trick that, Holmes writes down a name and shows it to the
Mm,
Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister sort of, acknowledges, but we don't know who it is.
mm. And again, that's for those who talk about Holmes and his limitations and so on. Knowledge of politics nil. Well, that
Yeah,
shows
well,
knowledge of politics strong.
a lot. Yeah,
Mm,
absolutely. Maybe
mm.
by this time he'd got a bit more interested.
Yes.
Um, the other bit that the story's come in for a bit of criticism for, I think, is the character of Lady Hilda. This is where we get into sort of difficult waters with the character of Sherlock Holmes, because I mean, I think this is where his misogyny comes in more apparent than pretty much anywhere else in the stories. You have the infamous comment about hairpins and curling tongs,
Hmm.
um, and of course he defaults to Watson that Watson will understand women because the fair sex is his department. Um, but lots of people have lined up over the years to basically be quite critical of dear old Lady Hilda.
Mm.
There was a survey of women in the canon done in the Sherlock Holmes Journal in the 70s by Pat Dalton, and Lady Hilda was described as an elegant and slightly dishonest nincompoop. And Martin Dakin, who you referred to earlier, described Lady Hilda as one of the most dim-witted of lovelies. So certainly a different era when that's the kind of criticism. But I think for me, I read Lady Hilda in a very different light. I think she's an incredibly people have been rather uncharitable. I mean, she's
Mm.
quite remarkable qualities to it. So she's cautious, she's cunning. That business about putting the light behind her in Baker Street
Yep.
so that she
Mm.
disguises her face. She dissembles. She can get back into Lucas's room.
Mm.
She's headstrong. I mean, Holmes really has to break her down for her to then accept his help at the end.
Mm.
And
Mm.
while you can say, okay, well, why didn't you put the letter back at any point in time? I think actually it's much fairer depiction that she's actually quite a strong character here. In fact,
Mm.
a lot of the qualities she has, including dissembling, are the qualities that we admire in somebody like Irene Adler.
Mm.
But I do think she's a much more interesting character than might at first appear.
Oh, definitely. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, it is difficult with this. Well, why doesn't she just put it back? Yeah, there might be, but nobody in this, the way you've been describing other writers criticizing Lady Hilda. Let's criticize Trelawney Hope, who does the same as I think it's Alexander Holder in The Beryl Coronet. I
Yeah.
could have put it in my safe, but I thought it was safer in the bureau at home. And Trelawney Hope is basically the same.
Yes,
That
that's
he could
right.
have put it in the departmental safe, and there would have been no problem at all. So, yeah, if his wife is dim, he's dimmer and less responsible.
Yeah, he
You
also
know?
he also falls for or apparently falls for Holmes managing to get the letter put back at the end. I think he's
Mm.
so relieved running around, whereas the Prime Minister is
The Prime Minister knows, of course.
immediately onto it, and you get that wonderful
Mm.
final line about "We all have our diplomatic secrets."
Yes, which is beautifully done in the Granada version
Yeah,
with Harry Andrews delivers it to perfection. And
yeah,
again, I'd come back, with what you've just said about Lady Hilda is that the casting in Granada of Patricia Hodge.
yes, it was perfect.
It's the character you've just described
Yeah, it is. Yes, it's
is in
much more.
that.
Yeah, much more
Mm,
intelligence in that portrayal and character, and that final sequence with Holmes is really, really brilliantly done.
mm,
While we're on adaptations, it's worth
mm,
saying that the second stain was actually the first episode of the BBC series starring Peter Cushing and Nigel Stock, which was broadcast in 1968, and it's been missing from the BBC archives, like many of the programs of that era. It's been wiped, and sadly, that series has been particularly badly affected. But the audio of that first episode has recently been recovered by the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, and it was a donation from a former member with some audio reels. And once they'd been recovered, it transpired that one of them was an off-air recording of the second stain, and so now we get to experience a bit more of that. They do quite an interesting job with that adaptation. It opens with events in Paris, with a letter essentially being couriered to London, and then it follows Henri Fournay coming to England and essentially changing his name, and all of this is quite a very long setup before you finally get to Holmes and Watson really appearing. But once they appear, it's a pretty straight adaptation. They do a couple of nice amendments to it. So Lady Hilda has a very high-strung sister who it turns out has had a bit of a dalliance with Eduardo Lucas, which nicely sort of misdirects a bit later in the story. But otherwise, it's an interesting adaptation, and it's quite nice to be able to experience again Peter Cushing's version of Holmes. And in fact, we've got a clip that we can play from that episode.
Now, Lord Bellinger, I must ask you more particularly what this document is and why its disappearance should have such momentous consequences.
Mr. Holmes, the envelope is long, thin, pale blue, with a seal of red wax, stamped with a crouching lion. It is addressed...
Lord Bellinger, these details are interesting and could be of value, but I need to get to the root of the matter. What was this letter?
That is a state secret.
Oh, come, sir!
I cannot tell you, nor do I think it necessary.
You are two of the busiest men in the country. I also have many calls upon me. I regret that I cannot help you in this matter, and any continuation of this interview will be a waste of time.
I am not at liberty to say what the contents of that envelope were.
Could you say that unless it is recovered, there will be war?
I think it very probable.
Well, then, sir, prepare for war.
I always thought Cushing was quite grandfatherly Sherlock Holmes, but actually in that you get a bit of a terse exchange. And that's such a wonderful moment in the story, isn't it? That you get Holmes standing up to somebody he really shouldn't, or you wouldn't expect him to. So that brings us to the end of our discussion on the adventure of the second stain. If you'd like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you've enjoyed the episode, then please leave us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice, or you could become a sponsor at Patreon, and you can find out the details for that at the website. So, Paul, what are we looking at next month?
Next month, we'll be looking at a bit of an oddity, a Conan Doyle story that disappeared for decades. It wasn't known about for decades, originally published in 1884. In Castle's magazine. It's his druidical mystery, The Bloodstone Tragedy.
Excellent. So that will be next month. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. And I will insert the clip at that point. Yes. I do actually have it here, but I'm not sure if you can hear it. If I play it, can you hear it?
Not really. It sounds like I'm listening to it from Mongolia.